Merci pour votre participation et présence.
Thank you so much for your participation and your presence on this panel that is about new experiences of heritage and innovative approaches. Cultural mediation traditionally fulfills an intermediary function between the work and the audience. It's a part of a democratization of culture that makes the understanding of the work accessible to a larger audience, enables them to go and to cultural institutions. Mediation is also something that uses the work as a medium that opens the discussion between the audience and the work.
En tant qu'acteur.
Today, innovation in a lot of different areas is based, generally speaking, on digital tools, and mediation, of course, is part of that movement. It uses processes and digital techniques to enhance the work. So, digitization changes the relationship with the work.
Spectacularisation, mairesse de Disneylandisation, Casadas, de ludisme.
It enables to think of events just as Jacobi was speaking in a general manner and based on the various case studies that will be introduced to presented today. It gives us an idea of the new world we're entering. So there will be Alexandra Marasco, who is in a remote connection with us. She deals with innovation. She works for the National Research Council in Italy. Just next to her is Sylvie Sagne, who works for the CNRS, Mr. Philippe Saint-Vendrix, who is here today, who is the Director of Research at the National Musicology Center, and Marie-Alix Molinet-Handler, who's also joining us by remote conference, who is a PhD in geography and works for the University of Grenoble-Alpes in France. So right now I'm giving the floor to Alexandra Marasco, and I'm going to ask her to stick to the 10 minutes we've given her.
Thank you very much. I'm really very pleased to be here. It's a privilege to be here and share with you some insights from research on innovative mediations for opera conducted with my colleagues Barbara Balpi, Francesca Nicolais and Felice Ardeo within a project funded by the Italian Ministry of Economic Development. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Our purpose was to explore the potential of playful experiences for audience engagement with melodrama through the creation and investigation of a real-life escape room themed La Traviata as an out-of-context social experience able to motivate players to discover more about this opera. The next slide, please. The research is framed within a growing body of research focusing on the design, development, and evaluation of games in cultural heritage, as tools to attract, engage, and educate also audiences, which is justified by the huge diffusion of gaming in the society. Just to mention one figure, about 50% of the population in Europe play video games, and importantly, this previous research highlights the great potential of games to raise cultural awareness about intangible heritage for its preservation. Next slide, please. While previous research has mostly focused on digital serious games for cultural heritage, in this study we explored real-life live-action games, escape rooms where a group of players are locked in one or more rooms and have a limited amount of time to escape by discovering hidden clues and solving a series of puzzles. This game has been much studied also for its potential to facilitate the optimal experience or flow derived by the positive psychology Csikszentmihalyi, a state of intense involvement in the activity, and which is also associated to learning. And this is the reason why these escape rooms have gained popularity in the last years, not only as recreational attractions in our cities, but also as new learning environment. And in the last year, some museums and monuments, including also, for example, Palais Garnier in Paris, have adapted this scheme to provide visitors a different visit experience on site. Their potential is particularly related to the possibility to create an emotional connection with heritage through the game. The next slide, please. We explore its adaptation for the context of Italian opera as a prime case of intangible heritage that has been proposed for nomination to the representative list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity. Engaging tomorrow's audience is a major concern for opera houses due to the aging trend of the core audience, and innovative approaches are pursued to achieve this objective, also by bringing opera closer to the audience outside the theaters in usual places like airports. And two, to take the words of conductor Galeati, it's crucial for engaging new and wider audience, the possibility to promote involvement with the human emotions that are at work in the stories and characters of opera and that make opera eternal and alive. The next slide, please. We tried to experiment in this line with the creation of an escape room named Enigma from the Past for the La Traviata, one of the most performed opera of all, which has a long history of remediation. It was designed as a supernatural detective escape room, linking through the narrative approach the stories of two women, a medium that has just died, and Violetta Valerie, whom she was helping before her death. And participants had 1 hour to discover the story of Violetta, the main events that are associated to the big emotions in her life. The escape room was created in a real escape venue in the city of Napoli and experimented with about 100 participants who managed half of the groups to solve the puzzle in 1 hour. And after the game, we explored their perceptions through an on-site survey. The next slide, please. You can see here the picture from the first room, the room of the medium, where participants were invited to play and to take this mission to discover the story she was working on. Here they found a secret passage to a secret room in a wardrobe. The next slide, please. to discover the room of Violetta, and by playing with the objects belonging to Violetta, they eventually found the key to exit the room, looking at the portrait of Alphonsine Plessis within a mountain display, showing a mashup video of many performances of La Traviata in major theaters, revealing that the memory of this woman is regenerated and kept alive every time the audience attend a performance. The next slide, please. In the findings, in the following slide, I will provide you very briefly insights from the survey. Next slide, please. Our sample include participants from 14 to over 70 years old. Just over half is composed by players that already knew the story of La Traviata before playing. The next slide, please. And we investigated the themed experience to understand if the story and the storytelling contributed to create an immersive experience. Findings suggest that the story contributed to such an experience, immersing participants in the game, made it more compelling, and also instilling a feeling of being a different reality. The next slide, please. We also investigate flow experience by providing participants with a short description of this state and asking them to express their level of agreement in comparison to it. And findings suggest that during the game, flow was experienced both at an individual and group level, providing evidence of the social experience facilitated by the game. The next slide, please. We also explored the cognitive and affective attitudes generated by the game towards the opera, much more in an hedonistic also way. And finding suggests that there is a positive attitude generated by the game. For instance, for example, a majority agreed that the game stimulated the curiosity to learn more, and also that they enjoyed experiencing the story through the game. The next slide, please. And finally, we also investigated intentions and having positive evidence confirming the potential of this tool to stimulate intention to find out more, and also to stimulate interest into attending a performance. The next slide, please. To conclude, we get encouragement from this experimentation into the potential of this tool to stimulate curiosity also among younger and players who didn't know the story of the Traviata, to learn more about it and possibly also to attend a performance. The future research will investigate more how to make this experience more effective, also by integrating co-design research approaches that include the participation of users, stakeholders, creative professionals, and cultural institutions in co-creating this new playful experience of heritage. Thank you very much.
Je vous remercie, Madame Marasco.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Marasco. Thank you very much for sticking to the time. The organization has asked me to tell you that our session is recorded, and I apologize for not telling you earlier about this. So now I'm giving the floor to Sylvie Sang, who is telling us about an anamorphosis, testing anamorphosis. The artist, the monuments, and the inhabitant. Thank you very much. On behalf of Mediation, art is increasingly mobilized. This seems strange. The historic monument, it's weird that it would give it transcendence and make the the contemporary artists in a context that is designed by humanist view. For the audience, it creates a nostalgia, a different relation, and a new role, and it renews the direct contact and the living contact with heritage. Contemporary art and historical monument is controversial. In particular, the Colonne de Buron in the Palais Royal in Paris. There is an argument that says that historical monuments weren't always things that should never change. It is actually an accumulation of various tendencies of variant periods, and other people think that once the monument has been created, it's perfect and should never be changed. There's another position as well that says that a monument even is so different. It's modern art, which means that the historical continuity is completely cut. So various analysis has been done. The National Center for Monuments in France has done various research about this, but it doesn't seem as easy and obvious as one might think. The audience always has a view about what is done with the monument because things are not always understood very well. Mediation is necessary to make audience understand them. Contemporary art is often very rejected. There are negative reactions when contemporary art is added to an historical monument, but it's a misunderstanding most of the time. But not only that, we should be more nuanced. When we look at the concentric and eccentric circles in Carcassonne, you will understand what I say more clearly. At the spring 2018, there's the lower city of Carcassonne. The circles, the very bright yellow circles appeared. The artist used diffraction and anamorphosis, plays with points of view. The circles that are designed on the Porte d'Aude, they change. If you go through it, it changes when you move around, which means that the work changes depending on your point of view. The history of the monument is not told at all. It has nothing to do with the history. It's just a way of getting the audience to see this remarkable landscape in a different way. But in the field, some people think it's great and say it's very good for creation. There's a graph, the photo club of the city, or Bruno Guéguin, who does surreal work on the city. The artists are very happy with these yellow circles, and there are other people who use it as an emblem. So the rugby team of the city really like it, and then people who get married who want to get their wedding pictures taken right in front of the yellow circles. But not everyone is happy. Right after the attacks in Trèves and Carcassonne, it's considered to be in bad taste. People are asking for justification. How can you paint directly on a historical monument? How much does it cost to taxpayers? It's going to tourists are not going to come anymore. So there were a lot of protests on social networks. And then letters were sent to the City Hall. On April 5th, there is a petition that is launched on social networks. So this is the petition. The person who started the petition says this is utter garbage. On June 15th, there were 2,500 people who signed with lots of comments. It's difficult to know who these people are, because there's just their first name, or sometimes they don't always say when they live. But it seemed to be the kind of thing that happens when people only want to think about their own little village, their own limitations. And of course, the media and journalists in Paris think it's great. It's a good story to tell. So some people are asking for all of this to be taken out, and there are even people who are saying that the person who decided to do this should be physically attacked. So it went really far. And then suddenly people are taking the moral high ground and are talking about lack of respect. It's an offense. It's sacrilege. And when you ask people, the inhabitants of Carcassonne, it's not completely surprising, because people in Carcassonne love the city. Ghislaine, for instance, she says, if tomorrow there was an Al-Qaeda group that would raise the city to the ground, then we would be orphaned. Something very important, something fundamental would be lacking. Sometimes I think about it, and I think that if the city were gone, I would not be able to recover from it. So people think that the life inside of the city, think that it's actually Walt Disney. There's anything inside. It's desert. It's like a desert. There's no longer any soul in there, says someone. The city of Carcassonne, there's a space between the two walls. Is some place that the inhabitants like to go through when the tourists are not there. But now they say we can only see it from afar. When you see it from the Pont Neuf, it's always very pleasant. You always have to find the worst perspective. It's something that you see every day. The people from Carcassonne love to watch it. It's enchanting day after day, hour after day, season after season, because the light changes, the weather changes all the time. It's always different. It's very lively. It's a very lively landscape, and they feel it belongs to them because they are present every day. On July 14th, when there is this fireworks, this is the best moment to see Carcassonne, because usually this is something that people go to watch with friends or family, but this is a show that attracts a larger number of people every year. In 2015, there were 150,000 people who came to see that. And some people, like Patricia, for instance, said, we try to escape that. We go away unless we have people over, and we have to go. We only do it once every 10 years. There's a crowd. It's very loud. It's unbearable. So they leave the city. They leave it to the tourists. They leave it to people from the outside to enjoy Carcassonne on July the 14th. But that doesn't mean that people are against tourists. People think that the visit of Carcassonne could be made more interesting with guards in Buckingham Palace, a medieval weekend, for instance, with people wearing costumes, people in the shops wearing costumes, etc. So people say we don't care if it's fake, if it's not real. We want the clients to feel the atmosphere better. We have abandoned, we have given it up to the rest of the world. It kind of creates a third kind of past. It's not history, it's not memory, but more the product of some sort of fake history. Yet, people from Carcassonne don't think the past or memories should be the defining aspect of Carcassonne. For them, Carcassonne is something present. Varigny, for instance, an artist, has an ambition to invent a new present to that monument, and he does it without the people from Carcassonne and without the inhabitants, without the legitimacy. It's actually one of the faults that people found with this project. We were not consulted. It's nostalgia. It's a dream of heritage that is yours and only yours. So there was hostility towards these yellow circles. It's kind of a resistance, and it also says that people thought something they thought they owned is taken away from them. Yet it seemed to have been able to overcome that frustration and reinvent their city themselves, which means that it's not real innovation that was done. The inhabitants of Carcassonne found a way to repossess their city after all. Thank you very much for this presentation.
Merci Anna, mesdames, messieurs.
Thank you very much, Anna. Ladies and gentlemen, this morning, when some of the speakers were talking about what heritage is about, they talked about architecture, sculpture, painting, they talked about various kind of events, but we didn't hear the word literature, we didn't hear the word dance, we didn't hear music. And that's precisely that spirit in which I and several other people have decided to look into, to try to see why music is not there when there's a heritage site. Even when it is present, it seems to be completely disconnected with what it should be to be with. Vivaldi next to the Loire River is very beautiful, it's very poetic, but it doesn't match the message that we wanted to convey in terms of cultural construction.
So at our centre, our objective through experiments that we're going to be talking about in a moment ago, our aim was to focus on a number of different points. Now, this morning we talked about this tandem between art historians on one hand and cultural practitioners on the other. So we find ourselves in this merging, in this dichotomy between music specialists and musicians per se. So we have a lot of corpus of knowledge, thanks to digital, for example, that music specialists use just like musicians. And we can see that in recording equipment. But, once we've made that observation and the lack of music in cultural sites, well, then we had to think about what does the general public want when they do hear music. Now, this music can open up a new experience, like any other experience, and that we can think about over this two-day event. Now, I suppose this is a legitimate request. Today, we have more access to music than we've ever seen in human history. We've got YouTube, we've got Spotify, we've got, a raft of different entry points into music. So that's the first request. The second one from the general public flows, I would say, from this very hard-nosed reality, which is COVID. We've got a frontal format where we've got audience in front of musicians, which doesn't correspond to what people want today, maybe. And there's a request for musicians to change the format, the thing that doesn't work anymore, like those rock and pop contacts, punk, heavy metal concerts. I mean, I'm not suggesting doing heavy metal music in the Louvre, but there is a change underway in respect of these concerts. And then these people who go to these cultural sites, they want to learn something, they want to understand something. So why wouldn't we take that opportunity to offer them the same opportunity to learn and understand what music involves? Now, music has got a number of ways to reach us, and I think it's because it also vibrates our body, if you will. It's part of a flux, and that's why we're involved in what's happening, something that doesn't exist with a sculpture. Let's say it's marble. It's hard marble that doesn't have this very immediacy that music has. And music also draws inspiration from the current world. You can work on Josua Dupré from the 16th century composer who's dead now, but you can also turn to Michelangelo. But of course, these two come through the interpretation of the music, which is done today, which is very important and obviously of relevance. And then, of course, there are risks. When you put music in a particular area, it may be seen as invasive, which is the hidden side, maybe, of this corporality dimension. You can. It's very invasive, so you need to make sure that possibly you can tone that down or put it in the right place. Second danger is to be a victim of a multidisciplinary approach. We talked about that at length this morning. If all of a sudden music enters into a cultural site in a very commanding, overweening, overawing fashion, then it may not fit with the idea of seeing the music in that location. Third danger, this was mentioned obliquely this morning, it's what the public expects, technology-wise, that goes over and beyond what we can actually satisfy, particularly in labs. Now, that's a point that strikes me as crucial. And then, of course, there's another risk of not being able to get people to understand what the music is conveying, because it's difficult music, isn't it? It's a particular grammar. It's a vocabulary. Sometimes it brings you into a different auditive landscape, and you can't read that landscape if you don't have the key to turn that lock. And then the last risk, which is very considerable, and at all costs, you want to avoid getting bogged down in a false authenticity, and that would dovetail neatly, authentically, to a particular location. Now, we've run various experiments to involve large-level, broad-based, broad-profile publics. I mean, an exhibition, for example, you know that there are 30,000 people going to an exhibition. That's an example as well that we're going to see in just a moment. Open to the broadest public possible in a city. And here we've got thousands of people coming in and discovering what's going on. So we know it's visible. And we ran research, trying to track people's attention and looking at whether the visitors understood what we wanted to do. So first experiment I'd like to show you, a reconstruction, 4D reconstruction of the St. Martin Basilica. It doesn't exist anymore, that building, but we've got a very famous composer from the court of the King of France when he set up in Tours. And so the building has disappeared, but for all that, it can be brought back to life through music. So you need to go on site, of course, to see it. And the Publicum Musicae is not invasive, as you can see. It's seeking to isolate you into an environment. It's isolated from the rest of the exhibition space. And we did this in Mons, in this capital culture of Europe, where we were able to work on the emblematic composer of that city and a painter from exactly the same century who worked a few miles away and did an allegory of Louis. And you can see that in the Prado Museum. And you can see that both slot in neatly with each other. Another installation was in Fontevraud, the Fontevraud Abbey. Our installation showed how that building, which is empty today, resonated literally when there were nuns there, specific theatrical representations as well as singing. And then we had Tour 1500, an exhibition to try and explain how a Johannes Uppergame object works. Very difficult, actually, to approach. Now, what's at stake here? Well, there's technological stake to resolve. You have to find the right medium to get across this music message without getting it all cluttered up with parasitical music, let's say. There's also, we've got to think about a multidisciplinary approach to kind of get people to understand this cultural continuum that we've possibly cast into shade. You know, you go to a concert to hear music, you go to a cultural site to discover a cathedral. Sometimes you might have a concert in a cathedral, but in your visit of the cathedral, nobody's there to tell you about the cathedral when you listen to the music. So how can you make sure that you've still got that artistic or cultural continuum? Now, of course, there's an emotional dimension to this. I think we made mention of this a moment ago. Music moves you, doesn't it? But also you want to listen and learn how to listen. I suppose there's a twofold issue there. It's not always easy to grapple with. And then there's a political dimension. We saw this morning, didn't we? Municipal authorities, county, regional, national, European political realms don't necessarily coincide. But this type of thing, I think we all want this type of approach. If it is, it might actually converge to one single level. Otherwise, you're going to get atomized into individual approaches. So for this, the future for this type of installation is always to try to explore cultural sites and to distinguish two different sets of experiences and possibly two sets of emotions. One emotion which is individual, that you can spark through a contact point. Everybody's got a telephone, and with your telephone you can listen to what you want in relation to an artwork or a cultural site. This is a case in point, a different type of experiment that involved getting musicians to play in the royal residences between Versailles, Saint-Germain-en-Laye, Fontainebleau, and Chambord, and to show basically how the musicians could negotiate an acoustic space in that particular location. It wasn't only the building that was imposing its acoustics, it was also musicians were introducing an acoustic. And then the group experience, which requires deep-seated thinking, quite burdensome about technology, but also not to sweep to one side everything that's going on now, where you want to throw yourself into a 15th century music from a choir. And this is what we want to really very much get across.
Je vous remercie, Philippe.
Thanks very much, Philippe. Perhaps I can now hand over straight away to Marie-Alex Moulinier-Andloa, who's coming to us remotely. And she's going to be giving us a presentation on heritage and digital technology. Louvre, for example, is what she's addressing herself to. Thanks very much. First and foremost, my thanks to the organizers of this roundtable. Absolutely delighted to contribute. All right, then, perhaps we can move to my next slide, if that's all right. Next one. That's it. Lovely, thanks. So I'm going to be speaking with 4 bullet points. The first will be introductory in nature. Then I'll be looking at the methodology that I used, an analysis, and then I'll round off in my 4th bullet point with everything I've covered. So what's the underpinnings of this research? You want to understand the rise of digital in major museums to promote and deconstruct what Bourdieu, De Meo, Edelman described as symbolic frontiers. And now, what do we mean by digital? Well, these are technical procedures transforming any artifact in a series of zeros and ones, physical format, visual format. Perhaps we can move to the next slide. Now, the objectives for my presentation want to try to look at the usage of digital for museums and their presence on virtual reality platforms, social media, and digital museums, and also talk about the limits of said usages. Possibly, well, I'm going to endeavor to do so. Through my presentation, I'm going to try and bring out, say, 3 forms of experiment. One which is immersive, in other words, you're in a physical space. One which is augmented experience, so a kind of a shuttling back and forth between virtual and physical spaces. And then a substituted area, entirely, therefore, in a virtual environment, and which would involve representations. Perhaps we can move to the next slide. All right, to understand how I got from A to B, my work started in a doctoral thesis looking at the new territories of the Louvre. And at a given point of time, I became interested in digital, thinking about promoting and having a conversation with the broader public. Democratizing culture, making it more accessible, but also looking about the reputation of the institution that was the exhibiting space. Subsequent to a certain amount of research that was done, I was able to work on a digital museum in micro-follies, as it's called. Here we have tablets, we have virtual reality and what have you, and that can be deployed in various spaces, which means that you can promote and build a conversation with that territory and promote and adapt cultural artifacts in that area. Now, that's of interest. It links in, well, Microfollies links in to the Louvre because these are laboratories for major cultural institutions, for museums, to understand basically how these new paradigms, these new tools can help us rethink cultural experience. So research, format, appropriation, and relocation, if you will, of the cultural space. Perhaps we can move to my next slide. Now, of interest here, what I'd like you to take home with you, if you will, after looking at this research, is the matter of reputation. Here I'll be looking at the Louvre, promoting a museum over and beyond its physical space, and building a positive image, and building partnerships, and making the culture more democratic, working with the Louvre, but also small outfits, laboratories, for example, that will help these large institutions rethink themselves, and then thinking about a given area, setting up projects in that area designed to promote that particular area and deploy new museum formats that would be more immersive in nature. Perhaps we can skip a couple of slides. There we are. That's the one I'm interested in. All right, so the hypothesis underpinning my presentation. We've got these three experiences that are lived, augmented, and substituted. They're used to understand the meaning and the sensorial aspect of a given artwork. Make it also possible to work on reputation for the museum, a better understanding of the museum or museum practice. This obviously addresses itself to the general public. And the general public, therefore, how can you draw value from the digital instrument? And how does that fit in with their overarching project? And this would help us to think about how all that work fits into a given area so that digital can amplify, broaden access to culture. Now, I suppose the major question is how digital usage will be able to promote and make more democratic access to cultural knowledge, and how that itself transforms how that cultural art item is experienced. So, Louvre 2017-2018, huge amount of work was done to retrieve data. 1,500 pictures were looked at, extracted from Twitter. It was a photo database, and we did a topography of those various photos, where were they taken, how were they taken, and what have you. We had interviews analyzing the press, observations in the ground, and then mental maps with a young audience, for example. We had 30 or so mind maps to properly understand the link between the museum and its immediate environment. And then we got on board with an ongoing set of research, exploratory interviews and semi-directed interviews done at micro-follies, observations in situ, on the ground, and then secondary sources. It's involved a number of documents and working on press reviews. Next slide, just to tell you where Saint-Rond and Caylus are. Saint-Rond is a village northwest of Toulouse, an hour and a half away, northeast, actually, for Caylus. All right, perhaps now we can move to the next slide. What do we see here? Well, the first thing we can see when you really home in on the Louvre Museum is that based on photos and mind maps, quite clearly there are symbolic borders and which are materialized over the various objects that we looked at. And what's of interest here is that these limits have a high symbolic and representative charge. How do you do the Louvre, for example, as a tourist? And you can retranscribe that onto a virtual space to validate that experience that you've had of the Louvre, but also can improve the image of Paris. So it's an augmented and a lived experience of the Louvre Museum. What's of value here is that we saw that digital was a medium involved with a practical reality. And this conclusion came from our findings with this young audience that was polled. Next slide. Now, of course, there were various and varying reputations for the Louvre Museum. Cultural site, of course, social and geographical mental representations. And then the representations as it appeared over the social media. A desire or attached to a particular, or the appeal of a particular place. So this can increase the scope of the Louvre's reputation internationally and what have you, and to whet the appetite of people to enjoy the Louvre, but also the location of the Louvre to have a kind of to make sure that Louvre could be felt in other areas of the world. Third aspect, a bit secondary, I would say, flowing from these findings, the Louvre can create in and of itself a particular location. Next slide. Of interest here is that the Louvre was able to create that appeal. We move from a desirable place to a practicable place. And the microfollies, for example, that's pretty interesting because the Louvre Museum is a partner of that particular project, a digital museum project. See various collections that are available in a database. 3,000 artworks available, therefore, in the microfolly project. So you can see the Louvre differently, along different angles and cross-referenced or cross-pollinated with other museums. So you can build a hybrid museum, an imaginary museum with language borne up by a mediator. And this is very important in these digital museums. It's the person who is going to create a link between digital and the general public to forge a relation of trust and confidence. So you don't only have a substituted relationship. No, you're having a real interaction with the artworks. Of course, the question that begs is the financial aspect, because obviously you need to have people running the interviews and mediating and make sure, therefore, it's viable. You need to make sure that, well, you need to have somebody who can fulfill that role, working on the microfollies in its physical but also its virtual dimensions. That's a question for the institutions as a whole. Marie-Alex, you only have a minute left. Okay. Perhaps now we can move to the second microfolly of these two cities. They're very much written into a pedagogical, land-based and cultural fabric, works with local communities, schools and municipalities to offer projects. In Calus, for example, it's the industrial heritage of the area. We want to make that very tangible, very hands-on, and very much part and parcel of that particular location in France. So the Digital Museum is kind of a pillar for a broader project. In other words, a national or international network, because obviously there is an international dimension to this. Perhaps I can leap to my findings. So I think what you need to remember is that the microfolly's objectives was to draw upon a digital network, a digital tool rather, which is reassuring for the young generation, to have this substituted experience, to have this transitory museum, to make sure that we can draw the general public to these cultural institutions. Second, we want to make sure that local culture can exist and have them and breathe life in them through this digital experience. And then the third point, make sure, because obviously this is crucial with the microfollies, to make sure that you are involved. You're not just looking, not an observer, you're not on the sidelines. You're actually very much involved. So the question that flows from that is, how do you make sure that museum institutions can adapt to a general public through digital experiences in art history? Final point, looking at the limits and the opportunities, my last slide, the limits to take into consideration. Obviously, with this digital museum, there is a tension between physical stakeholders, the problem of equipment as well. With Calues, there was an internet connection problem to hook up with the digital environment. And of course, people's expectations are different. But there are opportunities. This makes something very specific with a specific appropriation of this tool, creating a heterogeneous network. And you can hook up with various partners. Something that's very varied, and you can show appeal to publics with different expectations. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for your attention. Thank you.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you to you. And thanks to everyone, in fact. Philip and all the other people who've made a contribution to this session. We've had very different presentations going to the matter of innovative mediation and mediation per se. And I think we've got 10 minutes for a Q&A or a debate. Perhaps I can set that going by offering possibly a link between all these presentations and offering possibly 2 comments or questions for our speakers, which will help us set the ball rolling. And then, of course, we can possibly, as I say, turn to the audience for a Q&A. So here are my 2 comments. So I've listened to the 4 presentations, and perhaps I can go back right to the first presentation. Now, in innovative mediation, is it successful? Because it's not enough just to be innovative, it has to be successful. And to do that, should you have to think about making something democratic, but also thinking about cultural democracy? So with that in mind, and based on your 4 studies, and thinking about their extension into the future, can we use new experiences of the cultural environment, and how can we link that in with museums as a cultural space? And how can you make sure that in this innovative mediation, how can you get the spirit of these cultural sites involved? Ecomos said, for example, where is the spirit of the place hiding? It's crucial, that spirit. It's crucial to feel that in order to establish a personal, intimate and specific rapport for each individual in respect of cultural sites, monuments and museums. The artifact, if it is made nude, does that leave any space for this intimate link to emerge? From this perspective, technology, is it sometimes a hurdle to that individual appropriation when you can see recurring pictures of people in front of a monument, let's say, not looking at the object per se, but buried in their telephone or their tablet? That's something I throw out at you for our discussion. Perhaps we can look at the order in which the presentations were made. Alexandra, perhaps you can start. Thank you.
To move towards these two objectives, it can be emphasized that human-centered approaches that put the experience of the actor of the relationship with heritage may be even more integrated from the very beginning of the design of these experiences. In our cases, for example, we had a previous activity during the project in which we tried to get an in-depth understanding of the relationship of audience, also through the help of the stakeholders, with opera in its multiple channels and dimensions of this experience. And this kind of approach that put the actors of the experience, they can also be citizens as well, not just visitors and tourists, may be very relevant to ensure that these mediations are designed to move towards this objective, and also to adequately transmit the spirit, the authentic spirit of heritage. In our case, we emphasize a lot the emotional connection with the experience. And even in the case of digital mediation, they can design to amplify rather than hinder the relationship, the bond between the visitor and the heritage, if they are designed upon an in-depth understanding of the multiple channels and the multiple dimensions of this experience that can be gathered through this kind of approaches.
Thank you. Je passe Sylvie.
Thank you very much, Philip. Well, just to pick up on this ideal of cultural democracy and democratization, which ideally mediation should be able to meet as an objective. But I mean, as ethnologist, perhaps I'm not best placed to answer that question. I think what you need to do is think about the indigenous meaning of the cultural artifact, to understand the experience, the perception, and the experience of the public. And that should be taken into consideration by the institution. Now, to pick up on the question of the spirit of the place, I would say that mediation, be it technological, artistic, whatever, I'm thinking about guides, for example, that is necessarily a break or a hurdle, because it interposes itself between the artifact and the general public. I think the problem is not so much totally unveiling or making nude an object, but a partial view of the artifact itself. But you can actually capture a fragment, at least, of that spirit of the place. Now, look at Carcassonne. It's a case in point. I think this perception offers other hurdles. Time, for example. People just come and go, don't they? On average, they only spend 2 hours on the site. So, in all likelihood, the price of parking is too much in relation to what they're getting out of it in terms of time-wise. And then, of course, arriving en masse, 2.5 million visitors to Carcassonne a year, outside of the COVID, of course, period. But people who come, who are really focused, who really come during the season.
As far as the spirit of the place is concerned, I think I've talked about it when I was talking earlier today. But the speaker is speaking without a microphone. I would say, generally speaking,
en plein cœur de tout ce débat, ça ne cesse. Et donc, lorsque on essaye de nous faire approcher lorsqu'on essaye de nous faire...
When we try to get closer to culture, when we want to have a massive consumption of culture, it's like asking science to go further than it can. It's not our objective. Our objective is not to make sure that suddenly everyone loves Wagner. It could give very bad ideas to Putin, for instance, if he started listening to Wagner. You know, there is some sort of reflection that needs to be undertaken, and I think everyone should be involved in thinking about this. What we want to show is that through micro operation, that progress can be made. It's only that way that we can really have some sort of bearing on a factor that is very important. What is actually cultural industries? We've taken this word, industry. It should, of course, it's a word that could be used, but it shouldn't be turned into the cultural artifact becoming a mass object, that the approach has to be a massive one to bring a mass. And I believe that in that area, we should carry on much more reflection than we currently do. Thank you very much. There are various. I would like to know how much time we still have for our debate. So I'm going to give the floor to Marie-Alix. I want to pick up on what Sylvie said about over-tourism. With the case of Louvre, there's this kind of tension between the necessity and the desire to make it more democratic, to reach a greater audience, greater public, and then at the same time, this huge pressure with the number of visitors inside of that heritage. The COVID period, with the borders being closed, the use of digital tools was a way to think differently about our visitors who come from very close. And I want to make a link with the microfolies. I want to say that the use of digital resources is something that we think in terms of it being a tool, not a purpose in itself. It's some sort of transient thing that enables you to get somewhere. Of course, you don't have access to the Louvre. Of course, you don't have access to Centre Pompidou. You have a representation of the works that are exhibited in those places. But the fact that you see them in virtual reality, the fact that there is a mediator with you that's walking you through, it transforms your experience. And somehow you're sort of almost touching, in a almost a sensitive way, the artifact. And we believe that it's something that should be really looked into, and that's what I'm working on in my research currently. We still have a minute for a question, so I'm going to ask the audience, is there anyone who would like to ask a question to one of our speakers or all four of them? Please go ahead if you'd like to.
Donc, on va respecter le temps qu'on avait.
So no one wants to like the floor, so we're going to stick by the time that was given to us. Thank you very much to everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you very much to all of our speakers for those very interesting presentations. Thank you very much.